So we're just going to jump right into this one. I drew up a camp knife style profile and stuck it onto a piece of 5160 bar stock. I traced it out and then went to the porta bandsaw to cut it out. This is a brand new Milwaukee blade and it cut through this 1/4 inch stock pretty fast. It's rough, but I'll clean it up on the 2x72. 20 or so minutes on the grinder and I was left with a pretty good looking profile. I used a jimping file and added a nice place for my thumb to rest. Here I am scribing and scratching some lines so I can do some file work on the spine of the knife. Once I had some reference lines, I got to work with the micro files. It did not take long, 20 minutes maybe, to get this profile design on there, and it'll look pretty cool once it's done. I added a secondary bevel, which I think is going to add to the overall look of the knife. There it is. We're going to leave that one there. I then used a bevel jig to establish my primary bevel. I went through the grits, started at 36 grit, and ended at 120 before finishing it with a Scotch-Brite belt. I then went over to the drill press and made some holes for some pins. After I had the holes in there, I cleaned them up with a chamfer bit. That's what it looked like when I was done. For the scales, I'm using some synthetic fiberboard, which I picked up from my local Woodcraft. Back on the drill press, I drilled a few holes and then scratched the blade profile onto the scales. I used the porta bandsaw again to cut them to a rough size. I then cleaned them up with the belt grinder. I finished the top portion of the scales because it's extremely hard to do after they are attached. And that's what I was left with. Now I'm getting ready for heat treat. It was a little cold. My oil was 31 degrees. I used some scrap mild steel to throw in the forge. I brought this up to a very hot temperature to preheat my oil. I ended up bringing my oil to about 125 degrees. The blade went in the forge next. I ran this up to temperature and let it soak for about 5 minutes before dipping it in my oil. After 2 temper cycles, I used some Windex and 220 grit sandpaper to clean the scale off the blade. I then went over to the grinder to finish up the bevels. I started with 120 grit and went up to 400 grit before finishing it again with the Scotch-Brite belt. This is what I was left with. I think it looks pretty cool. I then spent quite a bit of time and finished sanding the blade. My shop lighting is not the best, but I called this a finishing point. My preferred epoxy is West Systems G-Flex, which I used to glue these scales on. I got it glued and clamped up and let it sit overnight. The next day I took it out of clamps, back to the porta bandsaw to cut the pins flush to the scales. You guessed it, back to the grinder to finish cleaning up the scales and profile them as much as I could. Here is the first look at what the decorated portion of the spine is going to look like. I then finished sanded the scales. That was pretty quick and easy. Put a little polish on the scales before putting the final edge on the blade. I made this thing really sharp. Check out the final product.